Okay, so I thought I'd just make this quick, well, maybe not so quick tutorial on how to add JavaScript, which requires jQuery to an Elementor page. You get a lot of advice from different people on how to solve problems by adding some JavaScript, and that can be really, really confusing for people as to how do they do that and where do they add that. So really just to set the tone of this tutorial, it is not a JavaScript tutorial. JavaScript is far too broad, far too advanced for a brief introduction. What this is an explanation of how I use JavaScript on Elementor pages that require jQuery, some of the coding standards and styles that I use, and the reasoning for the methods that I use. So in a nutshell, I use HTML widgets on a page for my JavaScript. I use the new ES6 JavaScript syntax, unless ES5 makes more sense. In some cases it will, which I'll explain. Wherever possible, to interact with the widgets, objects, the document object model, DOM, or whatever you like to call it, I use jQuery. I find that it is a lot easier to write, a lot easier to read. And for those of you who's not familiar with it, jQuery is a JavaScript library, which makes it a lot easier to do some of the stuff that you would do in native or vanilla JavaScript. I always use what's known as a closure, which I'll explain, and that gives us isolation of our code so we don't get clashes with other code, and you can reuse the same code on the same page without problems. And I always prefix constants and variables with the dollar symbol if they're intended as a jQuery object. Just a given standard these days, or for some time, that dollar is for jQuery. It's not by default. By default, you refer to jQuery as jQuery, but most people, when they use jQuery, they refer to it as the dollar symbol. So I'll show you how that works as well. And I always initialize my code on the window load event, not the DOM content loaded event, which I'll explain why as well. And I'll put some links in the description to ES6 and jQuery documentation, so you can have a bit of a play with that if that's where you want to head with this. So there are a few ways to add JavaScript to Elementor. Now, as I said before, I prefer using the HTML widgets, and I'll explain why soon, but the Elementor does have a feature under Elementor custom code. We can add new code, give it a name. Where do we want to put it? Let's say we want to put it in the body end. And when you put it in the body end, you get this little tick box which says always load jQuery. What that does is it makes sure that the jQuery library is loaded before your script. That's one way of doing it. And then if I went console log jQuery, that will work because jQuery is loaded before this. If I decided to put that in the body start, jQuery gets loaded in. I don't get the option. When I log jQuery, I'm going to get undefined. If I try and use jQuery, I'm going to get errors in JavaScript. So you can do it this way. Like all the other Elementor templates, etc., you then set conditions. So you can say what pages you want this to be on. Although this is a great tool, I prefer to do it on the page unless I'm going to apply the same code to multiple pages. More often than not, when I'm using JavaScript on a page, it's to change the way widgets interact with each other, or what they do when you click on something, scroll over it, or whatever. So I don't generally use this as a global thing, but there will be some cases when you do. So let's go back to my page I've created. So it's got a blank page I've called JS Primer, and I've got nothing on it at the moment. What I'd normally start with is an HTML widget. I'll just drag that into here so it creates a section and adds an HTML widget to the page. I normally rename these to JS if they're for JavaScript. Just makes more sense than you might have another HTML block that's something else. It's just an easier way to do that. So for JavaScript to work, firstly you have to enclose that in a script block. So there's my script block there. A few things I mentioned before was the syntax that I use. So the old, which you can look up yourself through Google, the old ES5, the ES5 syntax. You might declare a variable as var a equals 1, right? Now, the problem with ES5, or one of the big problems with ES5 is it's very loose. So when you declare a variable, like in this case, A, you should not be able to redeclare that variable. So if I've got a whole bunch of code here, bunch of code, and in the further down the track, I go, okay, I want to declare variable A equals 2. Technically, that should generate an error because we've already defined this variable up here. With ES5, it does not generate an error. It just works. And that's actually a problem because you end up with very messy code where you can redefine stuff that's already been defined. And down here, you might refer to variable A equals, if we go var B equals A plus 1, you may not see this. That might be hidden in some other code. You're thinking it's this A up here plus 1, but it's actually that A there plus 1. So it creates confusion in code. ES6, what they've done with ES6 is instead of using the variable or VAR keyword, or declaring your variables with VAR, variables are declared with let A equal 1. Okay? And down here I can say A equals 2, and then A equals 3. That's quite okay because A is a variable. If I said let A equal 4, this will generate an error. And the reason it generates an error is because we've already declared it up here. So the idea is that we don't want to have time. So let's say we might say timeout. Let's say we have a variable called timeout. We've got a whole bunch of code that refers to this timeout. We forget all about that, and further down in the code we say let timeout equal 4. We've now redeclared this timeout. Now ES6 will generate an error when we do that. So down in the console, there'll be errors generated because this is not valid because it's already been declared. So that's the using let instead of var. The other construct that they have is constant. So const, constant delay equals 20. Okay, so I can use the constant delay, but if I went delay equals 30, that will generate an error because this is a constant. You cannot redefine the value of that because you've told it up here that that's a constant. You can't say let delay equals 30 either because that's been defined as a constant. That will throw up an error in JavaScript. Now, at first you might look at it and go, well, okay, well, that's less flexible. But less flexible is actually better because it forces you to code correctly and not reuse stuff that you've already determined it's a variable or it's a constant and you've already defined those. So that's the first thing that I really like about ES6 syntax. So instead of using var, use let for variables, use constant or const for constants. So that's the constants. The next thing is if we go to ES5 for functions. So In ES5, I might do function, test, and property, and then console, property. Okay, so that's saying my function called test is going to log this property to the console. If I went to ES6 syntax, and you can actually use both in the same code, and sometimes it will make sense actually. So in ES6, I would say constant test equals property, and I use what they call the arrow function. Console log property. So this is the ES6 way of doing it. If I have two property and price, if I have a second parameter there, I would just basically wrap that in brackets, comma, price, and there's my ES6 version of that. So this is doing the same thing. It's just, this is the ES5 way of declaring that function called test. This is the ES6 way of calling that function called test. Now, where it gets cleaner is when we're doing things like callbacks. So if I went set timeout, which is basic JavaScript function of my function, and then my delay. So if I want to wait 2 seconds and then execute a function. Okay, so the old way of doing this would be function console so this is the old ES5 way of doing it. Okay, if you've got properties that you're passing in, you can chuck them in there. So this is what they call an anonymous function. So there's no name to it. It's just an anonymous function. ES6 way of doing this is basically two brackets and then the arrow function. That's the ES6 way of doing an anonymous function. Cleaner to write. So it's nicer to use, cleaner to write. If you get into the standard of using ES6, it's the more modern way of using JavaScript. It's got a lot more features than what I'm talking about here. There's things called constructors, destructors, which we won't go into here. Or as I said, I'll put a link in the description for where that is. But even this is pretty cool. Now, where this doesn't make sense is when you're dealing with some callbacks. So if I went a jQuery so if I went body dot on, we'd never do this, but click. Okay, now we're going to put our function we want to call when someone clicks the body. We go to there, we create a function. And do something. Actually, I'll console log this. Okay, so now this is a callback on a jQuery event. So what that will do is this keyword will refer to the element that was clicked. So this context would be the body. So inside this function block here, so all this here, this refers to the element that was clicked that generated the event. If I did this with ES6 and I went like that, this refers to the code block. So anything from the beginning of this block, so that this property is no longer what was clicked. So they difference between the ES5 function declaration and the ES6 function declaration is the context that is within that function. So that's an interesting change. What it does is if I've got, say up here, if I've got constant, delay equals 20, okay, and I access delay in here, log console log delay, that's referring to this constant because that context is this block of code. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So typically with jQuery callbacks, if I don't need to reference what was called, then I will use the ES6. If I need to reference what was called, then I might use the ES5. Now, some of these functions also do pass in a parameter, so I put E for event. Then we can console log E. The E would be the event that was called, which will actually have the body there in this case as what they call the current target. So you can still access it that way. Just depends on what you actually need. A great example of that is the sliders. Up here, if I go to the image carousel or these slides, Elementor will use a library called Swiper, and when you get a reference to that, when you use a callback on Swiper, this is actually the Swiper reference. So in that case, you would have to use function, and then this would be the actual swiper. So this dot next slide might tell it to go to the next slide. So really, you will have to use ES5 functions if the callback passes properties as this and doesn't pass them in as parameters to the function. Now that's a little bit complicated, but that's a little bit of a reason as to why we do that. Okay, so jQuery. So why jQuery over vanilla JS? So when we look at just add a title on here, so I've got something page, add a heading. Something on the page, I'll update that and view the page. There it is there. So let's go back to here, go back to F11. So when you open a new tab, it doesn't show up in the old tab. So if we have a look here, that's basically the page. We've got a heading and I've got some JavaScript code underneath it. If I have a look at the page, so what we're looking at here is what they call the DOM, or the document object model. If I look at the page source, what we got is our HTML, we've got a head that loads a bunch of stuff, sets our meta, sets some styles, loads some other styles. We then go down to the end of the head, got the body. Inside that body, we've got divs, and then we've got divs sections and divs underneath that. So this is the HTML that gets read by the browser. It then gets converted into this document object model. So as we browse through these, so for example, go to main, header, I've got an H1. So to get to my heading, I've got to go through body, where are we, main, header, H1. So my document object model passes through to there. So jQuery, is a library that was written to make it easier to manipulate or work with this document object model and JavaScript, because JavaScript to the average user was just so much harder to access the document object model. So if you wanted to change this text up here, in fact, if we grab that there, I'm just going to copy that and I go to console. So if I go, oh, there you go. So if I go constant title title 2 because I can't redefine the constant, equals so the mistake I made was not putting the dot, the entry title. And then I'll go title 2. Typos. So I've just changed that text. Now the jQuery part is this here where we find the entry title. So I'm saying my variable, my constant in this case, using jQuery, find the entry title. Now looking at the HTML here doesn't have the dot. It's just called the class of entry title. When you define that class with your CSS, you put a dot in front of it to refer to a class. You put a hash in front of it to refer to an ID. So with jQuery, we have to refer to that as the entry title with the dot. And then we can use these jQuery functions like text equals that. We could then maybe using HTML. So if we go title 2 .html, and I'm going to make that a bold test 2. Maybe we'll put an italic in there. What I'm doing is I'm saying set the HTML of title 2 to have the bold tag, test 2, italic test 3, and then close it. And there we go. So we've set that to a bold test 2, an italic test 3. So this is jQuery working with the DOM rather than you having to select that element using vanilla JavaScript and then changing properties with that. It's just a much easier library to use. Wherever you can, because jQuery is everywhere in WordPress and in Elementor, it just makes more sense to use jQuery for that sort of thing. Okay, closure. Now, so a closure, what is a closure? So a closure is when you open bracket. Again, I use ES6, so I'm going to go W for window, arrow function, open bracket, close bracket. Right? And then I'm going to pass in window as the parameter to this. So that's like an anonymous function where this is the parameter that I'm passing in the W. And I also generally put a semicolon before this. Now, what the semicolon is for is that if you have some badly written code that loads just before this, that doesn't end with a semicolon, when the optimization runs and you minify your JavaScript, that can cause some JavaScript errors because it basically will start appending this line here without the semicolon to the last script that was prefixing this. So if it didn't end in a semicolon, which it should do, then you can end up with poorly minified code. Okay, so our closure is this open bracket to that close bracket with our anonymous function in it. Okay, what does this do? Now, if I put in here let a equal 2, all right? And if I then tried to go let a equals 2, 3 here, that would generate a JavaScript error. If I do constant b equals 3, and down here I put b equals 5, that will generate an error because we've defined b as a constant. However, if we use this as a code block where it's closed, let's copy all of that and we'll add another one here. This will not generate an error because what this closure is doing is it's setting the context within that block. So these are completely different contexts. So you can reuse this on different HTML widgets, etc. So I might, for example, create some JavaScript which interacts with a slider. And I'm saying, okay, I want to have my slides equals, Jquery slides. Okay. And down here, we might, let's actually make that simpler. So I'll make that a constant because the slides aren't going to change. So then I do something with my slides here. In that section there. Now, I then duplicate this here and I use that somewhere else. That will not cause any problems because of those closures. These have completely separate contexts. So you can reuse this code on the page without problems with these variables and constants and function names clashing with each other. That's why we use the closure. Okay, with jQuery, now this isn't a required thing, but it is something that I do. So by default, jQuery in WordPress now, it used to be that jQuery would be assigned to the $ symbol. So you can either use the word jQuery or you can use $. That doesn't happen anymore. Some themes, some plugins might do that. But if you want to simplify it, then you need to do it yourself. So if you went constant $equals jQuery, and by the way, this won't work here yet, and I'll explain why. And then we went, I want to get a list of all the headings on the page. Okay, so let's find out what the headings are. So the headings are called, where is my heading? Elements. Okay. The Elementor widget heading. So if I wanted to get every single heading on the page, I would go constant $ headings equals $dot Elementor heading widget. Now have a look over here. I have got lots and lots of errors. Now, why is that? The reason for that is because at this point when this code runs, jQuery hasn't loaded yet. So let's have a look where that is, why that is. There we go. There's my jQuery there. That's way down the page here compared to actually, for some reason in this case, it's up the top. So I'm not sure why that is, but it hasn't actually, oh, maybe it's got some lazy loading. So it hasn't actually loaded that yet. So if we look at the network and look at the JS, jQuery is actually quite far up the page. So it should have actually loaded, but for some reason, maybe it's to do with the lazy loading of WordPress now. Okay, so how do we make that work? So basically we have to wait for the window to load all the content. So what we do here is we go window, got add event listener, and we're just going to use the load event. Okay, and then we just do an ES6 function, anonymous function, and in here we'd say let out of there. Headings. And in here, then we would add $ equals Jquery. And then we would add our headings equals $Elementor widget heading. Okay, so I update that. And then have a look at my page, console. There's no errors generated. That's just the favor icon. So I'm not getting any JavaScript errors here. Okay, so let's go back to here. Right, so what if I want to add a class to all of those headings now? So with Jquery, all I have to do is do $headings .add class test class. Okay. Now I'm going to add a couple more headings here so you can see what this does. I'm going to go duplicate that, add it again. 3 headings. Now it's as simple as, because the headings is getting .Elementor widget heading, and there's more than one, it actually creates what they call a Jquery Collection. Okay. Now with Jquery, when you call these methods on Jquery objects or Jquery collections, by default, it will iterate through every one of them and apply that method. Show you what that means here. Okay, if I look at that heading, I've now got, where are we? Here we go, test class. It's on the widget element. If you wanted to add it to the H2, we can do something different. I'll show you that exactly as well. There we go, we've got test class on that, test class on that, and test class on that. But we've only had to write one simple line of code. So if we wanted it to be different on each one, all we have to do is add the word each, and then I'll do our, so I'll do the, in which order it's in, let's just have a look. So I think it's the element, and then the index, if we do add class test plus, I think the index is the second one. Like that. What we're doing in this case, we're actually going through each one of these. And just see what it did there. Didn't work. So the index is the first. So that's why it didn't work. The index is the first, which is why it didn't work then. So what I want to see is test 1, test 2, test 3. Why are we not working? Oh, there we go. So here's my mistake. Because I use the ES6 function, arrow function, this refers to the block. This is a great example, actually. So if I change that to function, I, E, and try that now. this will work because this is actually referring to the callback from where it came from. We go test 0, test 1, test 2. So that was actually a really good demonstration of the difference between the ES5 functions and the ES6 function. We can actually do this because the element is passed in. So instead of using this keyword, we'll use the E, which is the element that was being called. I'll try it that way. And there we go, test 1, test 0, test 1, test 2. So the little lesson there, which sometimes we forget, is ES6. This refers to the code block, the entire code block. ES5, ES5 being function without the arrows. This is the element that's being passed in. So in this case, E and this are exactly the same thing. That's one of the things that's different about this. Now, I've seen some people use instead of the load event, the DOM content ready event. Now, from what I've found, if we look here, there's a document on that. So here's a little document from Stack Overflow. So DOM content loaded, sorry, not ready. DOM content loaded fires as soon as the DOM hierarchy has been fully constructed. The load event will do when all images and subframes have been finished loading. Now, reading more into this, what that's saying is that if I look here, I've got, as I said, I've got my DOM from the HTML, head, body. This has been constructed, so it's read all this HTML, which is basically text. And then it's created from that this document object model, or the DOM. Now, that doesn't mean it's loaded all the JavaScripts and CSS and images and all that sort of stuff. It just means it's created this and it's ready to get all of the stuff to display. The reality is when the DOM content loaded event fires, it doesn't necessarily mean that your JavaScript has loaded and been passed. So if we're looking at here and we use DOM content loaded, let's say, for example, in here we reference a slider or an image gallery or something like that that uses some JavaScript, we can't be absolutely sure that that JavaScript is actually loaded and ready from this event here. From the load event, we can, because load means that it's got everything that it needs for this page, passed all the content, and it's ready to go. So it's a little bit further down the track than the DOM content loaded. Look, sometimes I find that if you use DOM content loaded, what you're doing in here works anyway. I just think it's safer to use load and just make sure that the script that you're trying to access actually has loaded and has actually run. Otherwise, you're going to get errors in here when you try to access. So that's pretty much that. Now, there's one other thing I'm going to mention here. One other thing that I do is at the bottom of my script here. And this is just because of Elementor, the way it works. And this is one of the reasons I like using the HTML code block for JavaScript and CSS rather than the additional code function of Elementor, is that every time you press a key, it reevaluates all of this and runs it. So if I'm doing something in here like changing a script or change a color or something like that, as I type those things here, this will update. Now, the thing is, because we're listening for the window load event before we initialize anything, this will never update in the editor. So what I'm doing here is looking at the window object and looking for a object called Elementor Pro Preview. Now this is just something I've come up with where I notice that when you're in the editor, and again this is only if you're using Elementor Pro, then this object exists. When you're in the front end, this object doesn't exist. So I think it's safe as long as they keep using this object. I look for this, and if it's not undefined, then I dispatch a dummy event on the window or load. So the idea is that as I type, this should trigger, this should run, and that should trigger that event and initialize all this. So while I'm doing this in the editor, I can see the updates. So that's just a little trick that I've learned for working within this editor. Yeah, so that's a lot to cover, and look, there's a lot to this. Now I've only just scratched the surface with Jquery, with JavaScript, and with doing this in Elementor. I do believe that using Jquery wherever you can will certainly make it easier. Vanilla JavaScript now does pretty much all the same things that you can do with Jquery. It's just not as easy to read, not as intuitive, and I find my code a lot more concise when I do it the Jquery way, and let Jquery deal with all the vanilla JavaScript in the background. Now, others might disagree, but that's how I do things. So I hope that's been helpful for some people, and I hope you get some value out of this.